to Family Politics, a show where I talk to my extensive and extended family about matters which affect them personally. My name is Ian Rexhawks and I'm going to be standing in the next general election as a Lib Dem candidate. Although this isn't a show about me, what I'm hoping to do is to use these discussions to shape my own views as a parliamentary candidate and make me a better parliamentarian for the whole of the UK, as well as my local constituency. For this episode, I have as my guest, my dad, David. Dad has no real idea what to talk about, so he made the mistake of leaving it entirely in my hands. As a result, I decided to fall back on one of my favourite topics, namely electoral reform. Hope you know something about that,
Dad. I do. I have a very limited knowledge of electoral reform, really, just with the sort of examples that exist around the world. Particularly the one that comes to mind is Italy. And I know that their experience of proportional representation, for instance, has not been a happy one, largely leading to multiple elections with rather weak government. So it'll be interesting to hear your views on that.
Well, that's a really good example of when things go wrong. But I think it's probably fair to say that it would have gone wrong under any system of election. Any form of democracy would have led to a poor outcome. If you're in the position where, say, 50% of the electorate can vote for a sort of a far right person like Berlusconi as the classic example, I suppose, then it doesn't matter whether you're under a proportional representation system or a first past the post system like we've currently got. That person is going to get into power. The real challenge, I suppose, for electoral systems is to try and educate the population to the point where that kind of candidate isn't seen as a positive, isn't seen as someone that they want to vote for. And that, I think, is quite apart from the decision as to how you put someone in power, how you actually elect someone in the first place.
Yes. Well, I think we've recently had an example here of someone who was very popular, who got into power, and arguably changed the standing of politicians in the minds of the British public. And after that, under our current scheme, we then had an election of a new leader of the Conservative Party by a highly selected group. And that has caused no end of trouble in terms of the damage that it's done to our finance and our standing in the world and our reputation as, I suppose, a bastion of financial stability. So, electoral reform from that point of view, moving from a first past the post system to a true proportional representation, couldn't have done any worse.
It's genuinely difficult to imagine how the situation could be worse than what we've seen. And the position that we're in at the moment is that we had one Prime Minister who led his party and got a majority, and we can argue for hours about whether that majority actually should have been allowed in the first place. In my view is that it probably shouldn't, because it was 43% of the votes. That shouldn't mean an 80-seat majority. That should mean 43% of the seats. I just think that's a fair way of doing things. But the situation becomes so much worse when you realise that then, when he was forced to resign because of significant breaches of the ministerial code, of flagrant disregards for the rule of law. And who do we get? Well, we get effectively a Prime Minister in Liz Truss, who was just appointed by a very small number, as you say, of Conservative Party members. And then, worse yet, she is forced to resign, and we end up with Rishi Sunak, who got no votes because he was effectively the only candidate in the running, and therefore he was just selected and put into power. There was no democratic process whatsoever. But interestingly, I think it's a relatively interesting thing to talk about. But he's your MP, isn't he?
He is, yes. He is our MP, yes.
Do you
And I have to say that. Go on.
I was going to say, do you find that he does much work in the constituency?
He's well known throughout the constituency and is often seen in a variety of public places. He had an interesting meeting with a constituent in the Golden Lion in Osmotherley one evening. But certainly I've never met him personally. But he has a standing. He has a standing. He is a good orator. He comes across, anyway, I have no personal experience of this, but he comes across as someone who talks straight and doesn't promise things that he can't deliver. And from that point of view, I think we're probably in a much better place now than we have been for the last year and a half, 2 years.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that at all. I think we are definitely better off, certainly than Truss, definitely than Johnson. The real question is this the leader that we need and arguably as a country deserve? And my answer to that has to be no.
Yes, well, certainly given the other options, or the fact that we've had Boris Johnson and Liz Truss there, an awful lot of political trust went out through the window with Boris Johnson. And the problem is that he's a very popular person.
Yes, for some reason, no idea why.
He advertises himself extremely well.
Yep.
I don't know if he has a sponsorship with hair gel, but it's always possible. But he had a huge majority, which just shows that there is no such thing as bad publicity. But he, like an American president of recent times, has devalued the position of Prime Minister to a level that almost became laughable.
Yes.
If it wasn't so serious.
Yeah. And that's the thing is that there's a number of people that I've heard recently who have said, this genuinely would be laughable. It would be if we weren't actually having to live through it.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And the untold damage that Liz Truss and her Chancellor has done to the British economy has just made it all worse. And she was elected by that tiny minority of the country, perhaps the most extreme right wing. Here's our dog. Hello, Freya.
Yes.
How are you doing? Yes. She barges through these dogs. Hold on, and I'll just get her downstairs.
Go on, Fred. Go on. So,
I think Freya must be a fan of the show.
I did close the door, but the door's just push
I
on
can
their,
see
on their lap.
she obviously just doesn't see the doors as a particular impediment.
Yes. So, yep, and I think that the unfortunate thing is that proportional representation, will it get us a whole pile of extremely popular, self-publicizing, high-profile idiots in charge?
As opposed to now.
Well, as opposed to nearly now. So I don't think that. I mean, I know that, for instance, that Rishi Sunak is a self-publicist, but not in the way that Boris Johnson was a self-publicist. And the fact that Boris's publicity quite often was based on falsehood, and that's the worst. I really do think that there should be a law, an enforceable law against lying to the British electorate.
I don't disagree with that. I think there's a real reason why, you know, one of the most common things to think about in terms of politicians is the fact that they lie. And
Yes.
they're probably, I think it's fair to say, the least trusted position in the entire country. And, you know, the reasons for that is that basically any politician is free to promise the earth at any time and then walk back on their promises. And the excuse that I hear over and over again is, well, if they don't deliver on their promises, then the electorate is free to vote them out. Yes, but you look at
Years later.
there are serial liars. I think it's fair to say. Lost you for a moment there. I think it's fair to say there are serial liars out there. There are people who are quite happy to simply state whatever they want to state, and they are moved into seats that are particularly safe for that particular party. So we don't get rid of them as a matter of course. We don't get an opportunity to vote them out of office. Instead, they are effectively kept by their party, moving them from one constituency to another. They have no ties to a particular constituency. They just go wherever they're going to be kept in power, effectively. There are a few MPs like that. And I know that there was talk a while back about which seats they could parachute Boris Johnson into, because the chances are he was going to lose the Uxbridge seat. So, you know, when you factor in that there are so many problems effectively with the existing system, and you realise, the idea of a proportional system is potentially a bit of a worry, because it introduces the concept of voting for a party rather than an individual. And at its surface, that appears to be problematic for the reasons that we've just talked about. But in reality, when people vote now, I would estimate that probably 80% plus of votes are done on the basis of party anyway. So the reality is, it almost doesn't matter who's standing in a constituency. As long as they're wearing the right colour ribbon or rosette, people will vote for them.
How do you see proportional representation working in the UK?
It's a very, very good question. I usually like to start this one with a bit of a sort of almost a quiz. and obviously you're a father. I can fairly safely state that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's assume that you were running a children's birthday party. And let's assume that the birthday cake comes out and you have to work out how you divide it among, I don't know, 15, 20 completely insane children, because I remember such parties when I was visiting Rich and James. So what's the best way to divide that cake? As a parent, what would you do?
Well, obviously, you count the number of children there and divide it accordingly, apart from the big quarter that comes to me.
Fair enough. Yeah, I get that. So in that particular system, what you've done is you've effectively rewarded everyone for participation. And that's fine.
Yes.
Now let's change it slightly. Let's say that you want to reward children for the activity that you've done. So let's say that you're doing go-karting, for example. So you want to reward the fastest children, and I don't know, you decide for whatever reason that linking the cake to their performance in the race is the right thing to do. How would you do it?
Well, if it was just in terms of the birthday boy, maybe they should have the big quarter and everybody else has their little cut of the rest. So there's that possibility.
Yeah. So that almost is, if I was to introduce an example, an analogy, to the existing electoral system, that would be sort of a bit like hereditary power. In a sense, it's to do with their birth that gives them the entitlement. It's not their performance in that particular race. So really the question is, how would you go about it? Now, if I propose to you, let's say that, again, 15 to 20 people. And so what you do is you say, okay, person who comes in first gets the biggest slice. Person who comes in second gets the next biggest slice, and so on. And it carries on going through. But the idea is that every participant still gets part of the cake. They, assuming, of course, a quarter still goes to you, because that's a given. But does that sound like a fair way of linking the race and the performance in the race to the prize?
If performance is the big thing, yes.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment there.
Sorry, if performance is the criteria for judging it, then yes.
Okay. So what do you think the outcome would be if instead of that process, instead of that system, you simply gave the entire cake to the child that won? And that's regardless of whether it's, one of your children.
Well, that would seem very unfair.
And what do you think the outcome would be?
There'd be lots of unhappy children, and one that won.
I completely agree with you there. When I give this as a talk, I have this wonderful image that I acquired from Google of this child just crying, and it's absolutely what I think would happen if you went down the route of saying, okay, winning child gets the whole cake, everyone else gets nothing. And the thing is, the response from the children is exactly right, because the response would be, that's not fair.
Mm.
And they're right, that isn't fair. There's no question. That is just a ridiculous way of doing things. But it's how we do our voting. It's how we structure the most important part of our lives. Who gets to effectively make the decisions? We do in the way that a child would be able to say, that's not fair. We say...
It's not quite the same, though, is it? Because if you take that analogy through to voting, then there would be only one party.
So within a constituency, that's exactly what happens.
Right. Okay. So you're talking about lots of little cakes around the country, then.
Yeah, I suppose we are. If we're going down that particular, if we want to extend the analogy, then yes, absolutely. We need to be talking about the results of lots and lots of different parties, lots of different go-karting experiences, and lots of ways of dividing the cake. And in essence, what we now have is 650 people who got the largest slice of cake get to make the decisions about every other aspect of our lives for the entire country. And it doesn't matter how many people participated. It doesn't matter how close the race was. And in fact, the real absurdity, and this is one that I genuinely cannot believe is true. Do you know how a vote is decided if there's a tie? So do you know how an election is decided?
I always presume you mean in terms of one part of the election, one constituency.
One constituency, yes.
Well, there's a recount.
No, there isn't.
Is there not?
No. If it's a tie, they flip a coin. I kid you not.
I never knew that.
I kid you not. It has happened a few times in the last couple of decades. I think it's very rare because obviously the size of the electorate is such that an actual tie for first place is relatively rare, but it does happen, and it means that literally.
I've never heard that. I've never heard that.
As I say, it's absolutely absurd. And I didn't believe it until I actually read it, but it's genuinely the law that if a constituency ties, then the outcome is decided by coin flip. So all those people that vote for a winning candidate or a joint winning candidate lose their vote on the back of a coin flip.
Yes. Yes.
So you asked, how would proportional representation work in my model for it? And I think possibly we have to leave the analogy a little bit. We can't carry on talking about cake, although you know how much I like cake. That's not something that I can really keep going indefinitely. But the way that I see, if you think about it, when we have a general election, that is an opportunity for the entire country to make their voice known, to vote in line with their conscience. At the moment, the system is such that there's a great deal of tactical voting, of voting for the candidate or the party that is least odious to that particular person, not the one that they would actually prefer. So there's a number of situations that I can think of where someone has wanted to vote, for example, for the Green Party, but they know full well that a vote for the Greens would be a completely wasted vote in their constituency. So they don't vote. But consequently, that means that parties like the Greens, probably in a system where people's actual preferences were recorded would get more votes because people would not feel like their vote would be wasted. So that, I think, is the first sort of core principle, is that people should be entitled to vote in line with what they actually genuinely believe and have as an ethical preference. So those that want to vote for parties like the Greens should feel free to vote for the parties like the Greens, and they should be counted. They should be stood up. Westminster should be made up of, if 5% of the country vote Green, 5% of the politicians or the MPs should vote Green.
In your model of proportional representation in the UK, would constituencies, for instance, be abolished, and would the votes all be counted as one lump?
It's a really interesting question, because constituency at the moment is basically it's dictated by a member of parliament who is elected by that particular constituency.
Yes.
Clearly, that wouldn't work in a standard sort of proportional representation system. If you go by a purely party-based system, but there are systems where, for example, you still have a vote within the constituency for an MP, but that is then, so all of the votes are then calculated at a national level, so that you have additional MPs that are appointed by parties based on the amount of votes that were actually won, so that you bring the total number of MPs up to the amount that they've actually become entitled to because of their voting proportion. That gets a bit complicated, because you end up with effectively two separate systems. You end up with a first past the post system to elect a local MP, and then a runoff system of some description to sort out the balancing act, effectively. But I don't think it needs to be that complicated. I think what could actually work is this. So if you imagine someone who lives in my local constituency, for example, the one that I'm going to be standing for, they currently have a Conservative MP. If they are I'll go back to talking about the Greens, because it's an area that I've talked about already. If they're a Green believer, the chances are they are not going to be able to approach their MP for pretty much anything. The views will be diametrically opposite what they believe in. As a result, the argument that an MP and a constituent are inextricably linked, I think, is very weak. They're very strong if they voted for them. They're very weak if they didn't vote for them.
Yeah.
So what I think should happen instead is, and again we come back to the example of the Greens, if they get 5% of the votes, so what would that be? 32 MPs. What the party would need to do is, first of all, appoint 32 MPs, and secondly, almost create a constituency map of the UK and assign each of the MPs a number of constituencies. So it may well be that the best bet, because of the fact that the constituency map at the moment, it's based on population size. So it may well be that the best bet is to keep the existing constituency map. What they would then do is to say, okay, there are 650 constituencies, there are 32 Green MPs.
Green.
Therefore, each Green MP needs to take 20 constituencies. There's an argument that that would mean that each MP would then be taking far too much sort of geographical patch to deal with. But the reality of the situation is that if the vote nationally was roughly 5% for the Greens, then the expectation is that each of those MPs taking on 20 constituencies would only need to be representing 5% on average of each of those constituencies, and therefore they would have the same span, the same scope as they do now. So it's fairly complicated to think about, but actually when you then drill it down and you think, actually, does this make sense? Is there something there that we can work with? I think that there's a way to keep the local connection with the right people, and it gives people more choice. It gives people more connection. So, in my constituency, for example, I would have the opportunity to speak to my current MP is a Labour MP. I would have the opportunity to go to him or the local Green MP or the local Lib Dem MP, and I would be able to talk to whoever I thought would be best suited to represent my needs at Westminster. And I think that genuinely is a huge improvement in the current system, or over the current system.
What about even smaller parties?
So, I mean, how small?
You'd get an awful lot of those, wouldn't you?
Well, potentially.
You can go as...
So the way that it would work, and the way that it works in a number of places, is that there's a minimum threshold that a party has to have in order to have any representation. There's no reason why we need to do anything less than, say, 1%, which would still be 6 seats. And that's, that I think covers off the really tiny parties. But the reality is that a tiny party, I think, has the scope to become a fairly large party. Every party will start with, 1 or 2 key seats that they are entitled to. I don't see any reason why we would need to limit that at all. I think, we could quite easily say, the minimum is, say, 0.15 or 0.2%, which represents 1 seat. I don't see any reason why we would need to worry about that. They could quite easily get in, but tiny parties, they're going to have a tiny amount of influence. That's the way it should be.
And would local government follow this sort of scheme as well?
Well, I don't see any reason why local government should be done in any way differently. I think, and again, we come back to the constituency that I'm representing. They have at the moment a Conservative MP, and 100% of their councillors are Conservative. They did not have 100% of the vote, not by a long shot. So the question is, how well are the people that didn't vote Conservative represented within my constituency? And the answer is they're not. Aside from being part of the overall electorate, they don't have any say in how the constituency is run, how the laws are decided, how the tax rates are set, anything like that. They've got nothing, and that just, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't. It just, there's no way that I can sit here and say, yeah, that seems like a good system, a good working model for how we should elect our governments. So I think, yeah, it needs to be done on a local level as well as a national level.
Mm. And when you're bringing this in?
Well, if I'm ever in a position where I am actually at Westminster and allowed to put forward a motion or vote, it will be one of the first things that I do is to try for electoral reform, because I genuinely believe that so many problems associated with our country are because we have this archaic system where the assumption is that one party is entirely in charge for a given term, and then they either keep the power or they pass it to a different party. I don't think that system is set up in any way to allow long-term, really careful planning for the country. I think that it's designed to basically lead to a situation where the incoming party will, as a first priority, undo most of what the previous incumbents did. And I don't think that's feasible. I don't think it's viable for a decent running of the country going forward.
Mm.
So in answer to your question, it would be top priority for me.
Yeah. Yes. Interesting.
Well, that's what I like to do, to try and do, is to give sort of food for thought.
Yes. So, given that we don't have a proportional representation system at the moment, and there looks to be at the moment such a small drive for it to come in, how do you see the future of the UK political system? Do you see it changing to proportional representation in anything other than the very long term?
Yes, I do, and the reason for that is that I think that there's, if you look at the situation as it currently stands, every party apart from the Conservatives, and I'm going to just talk about Labour in a moment, but every party is committed to introducing a form of proportional representation. And the reason for that is because basically every party apart from Conservative and Labour would benefit under a proportional system. The current system is designed effectively to magnify the largest parties in power, their vote share or their power share based on a minority vote. So you look at the Tories, their 80-seat majority at the moment was achieved with, I think it was a 43% vote share. So they basically have the majority of the power, but they didn't get a majority of the votes. And they got that through the system. So every other party would benefit from them not having that. If you imagine that they got 20% of uplift over what they should have got against their actual vote share, then that 20% would be redistributed among other parties. So other parties would benefit from that, and the majority of them have said, yeah, we would want to introduce a form of proportional representation. The sticking point is Labour, and the reason for that is that they recently passed a motion in their conference to add proportional representation to their manifesto. But Keir Starmer, who obviously leads the Labour Party, has indicated that it is not part of his sort of priority for the party going forward. So if he gets into power, there's a real question as to whether he will actually abide by what his party wants or whether he will do what he wants.
There would, I suppose, be no reason for him to want to do that. He would want to stay in power at that point.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to bring about this type of electoral reform, is because actually the people who are in power at any given time have almost certainly benefited from the existing system over a proportionality system. So they are really not incentivized at all to support a change if they want to stay in power.
So I would have thought that the only way to have some chance of getting proportional representation in would be a plebiscite, a
referendum,
national election.
Yeah,
referendum. Thank you for giving me the word. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we had a national referendum on alternative voting, or the alternative vote, back in, I want to say 2012, but I'm not 100% sure about that. We had a.
What was that? That was alternative.
Yeah, the AV campaign.
I don't remember that.
No, well, it was both the Conservatives and Labour campaigned very, very strongly against it. It was not proportional representation, but it was a step away from first past the post. It would have made more proportional outcomes a likelihood.
Right.
But, as I say, both major parties, or both of the two big parties, campaigned against it because exactly what you've just described, it would result in them losing power, and as a result they just didn't think that it was the right thing for them to do, which I think Labour has finally come around, or is coming around, to the idea that actually if they want to retain any power going forward, they're going to have to acknowledge that actually what the people want really matters. And I think that we're starting to see a change in how political attitudes are shaped. I think we are going to see that the people demand more of their political system. And I suspect that is going to manifest itself in a change in the electoral process in probably the next decade.
Well, that would certainly be interesting. Do you think that, I mean, a lot of people say that proportional representation, although it may well give a more even distribution of power to those who have voted, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
For those who have voted. It is said to lead to a much weaker form of government.
Absolutely, yeah. But I don't see that as a negative. I actually see that as a strength of the system. It means that more cooperation, negotiation, and just working together in general is going to be, it's going to by necessity become the norm. The way that
we do have we do have political working together even under this system, though, don't we?
Not
we
really.
have cross-party committees.
You get party committees, you get cross-party committees, but if you think about any legislative change that comes into effect now, it is almost entirely drafted by the Conservatives and voted on by pretty much the Conservatives. The system is set up such that the government is formed by the majority party, and with that majority, the expectation is that they will be able to pass any legislation they want to pass. So the system is set up in such a way that actually the concept of working together is almost sidelined. It doesn't, you know, even the way that the party or the debating chamber of the House of Commons is structured, it's set up so that you have the government and the opposition. It's designed to be adversarial. It's designed to. It's designed on the assumption that basically the opposition is there to disagree with what the government says, but they don't actually have any power to overturn what the government wants to do.
But do you think that if there was proportional representation, and let's say at the moment it was a, I don't know, 55% for, let's say, the Labour Party, and 35% for 45% for everybody else, you would still have great difficulty in, for instance, formulating and passing laws because of people's political beliefs. It's and the threshold for getting these sort of things through would be difficult to reach.
The example
That's
that you
why
give there, the 55% for Labour, that would actually still give them a majority. So the position between that and the current system wouldn't really make much difference at all. The margin.
But if it was much closer than that, if it was closer than that with the proportional representation,
so
closer.
With proportional representation, you'd probably expect that the largest party would have maybe 40% of the votes, maybe not even that. So what they would need to do is they would need to come up with ideas that were deemed good enough by other parties to support them. So you look at the recent mini statement by Quartek. Without question, I mean, even within his own party, that was shouted down. But under under a system of like a proportional system, they wouldn't have been able to do that. They wouldn't have been able to simply say, "This is what we're going to do." What they would have to do is to bring it to the Commons, and they would have to say, "This is what we are proposing.
Yes.
Does it make sense?" They would actually have to secure at least 50% of MPs, which, if they only have 43%, that means that they need to find 7% of people from other parties that agree that what they're doing is in the best interests of the country. And I think if they were forced to go down that particular system, we wouldn't have encountered the kamikaze budget that we saw.
The converse of that is that it is going to be much more difficult to formulate and have accepted a particular law, for instance.
Potentially, but what I would say is that it's probably easier if we talk about a specific aspect of law. So, if we were talking, for example, about the migrant crisis, so at the moment there is a vocal minority that basically they espoused some pretty awful stuff. You know, sinking the boats, feeding the migrants to great white sharks. I kid you not, I genuinely heard that recently. It is horrible what some people want to do. But the majority of people in the UK say, actually, do you know what? That, to me, we're not doing enough. We're making the mistake of dehumanizing people who are trying to come to the UK because we are seen as a good place for people to escape some absolutely horrific situations. So in this particular example, if the majority of people say, actually, do you know what? We think that this is the right thing to be doing, then let's assume that we're in a proportional system and the Conservatives have 43% of the votes. That still means that 57% of the votes are for other parties. We can ignore, I think, the UKIP and Reform, which were the Brexit party, because I suspect that their heyday is behind them. But that basically means that some 57% of the power in Westminster would be in the hands of parties where the support is for a much more compassionate approach to dealing with the migrant crisis. And I don't see how, actually, if they proposed a law saying, actually, we want to process these migrants that are coming in a nice way, a fair way. We want to make sure that they're not subject to almost inhumane treatment at the hands of our border patrol, our migrant. It's, I can't remember which department it is off the top of my head, but the Home Office doesn't step in and deal with these people in a way that almost puts Guantanamo Bay, as a good place that they could have gone instead, and that's awful. But yeah, we end up in a situation where the majority of the UK believes that a course of action is right. It's much more likely to be actually listened to and implemented under a proportionality system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonder what will happen when the Labour Party get in next, then.
Well, hopefully, I mean, they're
particularly
very
in terms of immigration.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that there are things about them that I think are absolutely laudable. Reading through their manifesto, there were very few things that I would outright disagree with in terms of how they want to manipulate, how they want to make changes to the existing system. My biggest problem with them, or one of my biggest problems with them, is that their insistence on keeping first past the post basically means that a vote for Labour is unfortunately a deferred vote for the Conservatives.
Is it a vote for Labour is a deferred vote for Conservatives?
Yep. Because if Labour get in and they don't make the change, they don't make a change to a proportional representation system, if they get in, one thing that's almost guaranteed is that eventually the Conservatives will take back over from them.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So the only way that we're going to see a major change to the norm of passing from Labour to Conservative and back again is by bringing in a party that wholly embraces taking on proportional representation. And that means...
Or that the Labour Party does change their mind
Yeah,
and goes for proportional.
You know, fingers crossed, that's
or it
that's
becomes
what they'll
higher
do. Fingers crossed they do see sense and they go for that as their leadership, and they adopt the principle of proportional representation as their conference has indicated that they should. But as it currently stands, they're not embracing it, and therefore the problem is that it could quite easily just be almost forgotten as a promise or as a manifesto commitment. And if that happens, as I say, we're in the position where a vote for Labour is a deferred vote for Conservative.
Bit depressing, that.
Didn't mean to leave it depressing. I think the lesson to take from it is that actually there are parties out there that are really committed to driving through this change to the electoral system. And obviously I'm part of a party that wants to do that. The Lib Dems are very heavily committed to proportional representation. And I think what people need to realise is that actually a vote for one of those parties is not a wasted vote. It is under the current system, but it's only by voting for parties that want to bring about a change to the system can be changed. And it's very unlikely that that's going to happen anytime soon, but it is, if Labour don't change their way of doing things, if they don't embrace proportional representation, then the only way things will change is by voting for a third party that does want to bring about this positive change.
Well, it remains to be seen what will happen then.
Absolutely it does. So, exciting times.
Yes. May you live in interesting times.
Indeed,
the Chinese curse.
Yes. I think that's probably a good place to leave it. So, that has been a very good discussion. I certainly feel like there's a huge amount that needs to be done, but we didn't necessarily come up with any way to actually bring that about, except to say that there are some people out there that are already trying this, and offering support to them is probably the way to do it. So if what we have discussed today appeals to you as a listener, make sure you vote for a candidate that's espousing that particular view. So, thank yous. I'd like to thank my dad for letting me use the music for the theme tune and agreeing to be a guest. So, thank you. And that's despite saying that you didn't really know much about the topic, which I don't really believe, having gone through the conversation with you. And I'd also like to thank James for volunteering to help out with the videography. Thank you to everyone who's given me advice on getting the show launched, and thank you if you've just watched it, especially if you hit like and subscribe for future episodes. This has been Family Politics. I've been Ian Rexhawks, and until next time, bye for now.